I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alphonse Chapanis of Johns Hopkins University. Professor Chapanis is an expert in the field of human-computer interactions, or human factors as it's called. He's speaking today under the sponsorship of the University Lectures Committee with the assistance of the Departments of Computer Science, Psychology, and Industrial Engineering. The title of his talk, as advertised, was rather flamboyant: Prelude to 2001, The Psychology of HAL. The real, or subtitle of the talk was, Did Alan Turing really know what he was expecting computers to do? For those of you who are interested, Professor Chapanis will also be available for an informal seminar-type meeting tomorrow in 207 Marston at this time, 3:10. All are invited. And he will also be glad to entertain any questions you have after his talk today. Professor Chapanis.
In 1950, the English mathematician philosopher Alan Turing wrote an article that has now become a classic in the computer literature. In his article, Turing posed the question, can machines think? Now, the machines he meant were, of course, computing machines, which even 25 years ago were beginning to frighten some people, excite others, and astound still others with their power and versatility. The answer that Turing gave to his hypothetical question was in the best tradition of operationism and psychological behaviorism, although he didn't identify with either of those terms. His answer has now come to be called the Turing test. In essence, Turing proposed a test along the following lines. A person X is asked to communicate with two other persons, Y and Z. Y, however, is another person. Z is a computer. Now, since a computer obviously doesn't look like a person, Turing imposed certain conditions on his test that would conceal the identities of the communicators. But what he said was this: if X conversed alternatively with Y and Z for some time, and if at the end of this period X could not decide whether Y or Z was the computer, then Turing asserted that the machine had satisfied all of the operational requirements for thinking. Since Turing's day, in 1950, the ideal of a completely interactive computer system, so natural and so human-like in its responses that people would behave toward it as toward another person, this ideal has been the subject of a great deal of writing and the goal of a great deal of work. Modern computers, of course, have a great many limitations, but the last few decades have seen a fantastic increase in the number of computers and computer users. To say that we're in the midst of a computer and telecommunications revolution is to say nothing new. Computers already affect our lives in varied and often unexpected ways. Not only do they prepare our utility bills, our credit card bills, and bank statements, but they control our traffic, they help us to make theater and travel reservations, they sort through millions of details to find common elements in crimes, they help diagnose our bodily ills, and keep watch over us when we're in hospitals. The future holds possibilities that involve computers even more intimately in our daily lives. The physician who is concerned with proper drug dosages and side effects, the medical aide in some remote location who needs advice about how to treat a serious illness, a student needing help on some homework, a young couple trying to decide how to spend a night on the town, or a householder who's trying to order merchandise from a large mail order house. All these people may soon rely for help on a computer and do so through their own terminals. Now, if computers are to be used in the ways that I've just suggested at some time in the future, we need to think more carefully about the users of those computers. Because the people who will use computers in the future are almost certainly going to be different from people who have been involved with computers in their early development. Ordinary people, the people who will be using computers of the future, are not going to be computer programmers, nor are they interested in computers per se. They most likely will be interested in the computer only as a tool, as an appliance. They want to know, what will the computer do for me? And they don't care how the computer does it. In short, what I'm suggesting is that the person to which we should design is a person who is no more interested in understanding and getting into the guts of a computer than he is in understanding and tearing down his telephone. He wants both machines to do what he wants them to do in the way that he wants them to perform. Now, in a certain sense, the interactions between man and computer can be thought of as conversations. They're characterized by commands, statements, questions, answers to questions, and sundry other messages that go from man to computer and vice versa. The languages for these communications are, however, strange languages. Although they're continually being improved, even the best of them are stilted, esoteric, and sometimes frustrating. Even more important is that communication with present-day computers requires thought processes that are at best unfamiliar for most people and at worst unnatural. If we're to know how to build computers so that they can converse with people in human-like terms, we need to know first how people naturally communicate with one another. To put it the other way around, when we know how people communicate with each other naturally, then we'll be able to state the general principles that can be used in the design of truly conversational computers of the future. My reason for making this statement is at the very heart of computer design. Computers are, after all, just pieces of hardware. They're designed, built, and programmed by people. So if we want to have truly conversational computers, we have to be able to describe human communication in precise terms and to convey the rules of that human communication to those people who design, build, and program computers with which we will be interacting. This is the rationale that has been underlying attempts at my laboratory to get a more thorough understanding of human communication. In particular, I have been concerned for a number of years with three main questions. How do people naturally communicate with one another when they exchange factual information in the solution of problems? How is interactive human communication affected by the devices through which people converse? And what are some of the main independent variables that affect interactive communication? Let me take a minute to digress on the distinction between unidirectional and interactive communication. Psychologists have long been concerned with the communication effectiveness of what I call unidirectional communications. These are things like advertisements, highway signs, books, lectures, and television programs. In unidirectional communication, the person to whom the communication is addressed is treated as a passive recipient of information. Nothing that the recipient says or does affects the communicator, the communication, or its content. Interactive communication, by contrast, involves at least two participants, and the contents of any particular message cannot be predicted from the prior messages of any one of the communicators. Messages are determined in part by the contents of the prior messages of all participants. Conferences, arguments, seminars, and telephone calls are all examples of interactive communication. This is the kind of communication I'm concerned with here today. Experiments in my laboratory are structured to model, if you will, man-computer situations rather than to simulate faithfully any existing or planned interactive computer systems. What we do is to ask two-person teams to solve credible, real-world, factual problems for which computer assistance has been or could be useful. Now, to be sure, this is a limited class of conversations, but it's a useful one, and we have to start somewhere. One of my primary interests has been in the channels and in the modes through which people converse. The channels of communication that serve man and computer are being broadened, but the bulk of them are still carried on through some kind of typewriter-like device. In our program, we've used 4 different channels: voice, handwriting, typewriting, and video. That is the picture part of television without the voice. 3 of these 4 basic channels have been tested singly, and all have been tested in various combinations. And I call these combinations modes of communication. In one single experiment, which I will show you, we have tested as many as 10 different modes of communication. A standard of comparison that we usually use is normal, unrestricted face-to-face communication, a mode of communication that for a variety of reasons we've been calling communication rich. In our research, we use the term source as an abbreviation for information source and seeker as an abbreviation for information seeker to refer to the 2 subjects on our teams. You can think of the source as a hypothetically ideal computer, one that responds perfectly to language however it is addressed. And in other words, it is a computer that would pass Turing's test. And the seeker is the user of the computer. He's the guy with a problem, and he goes to the computer for information. By analogy, our communication modes are different input-output channels between the computer and its human user. Our laboratory has undergone a number of changes, and of course it is modified from time to time to suit particular experimental purposes. But if I could have the first view graph now, Dr. Young, we get a look at one particular configuration of the laboratory, which will show you some of the main features. The working part of the laboratory consists primarily of 2 rooms that are connected with double sound insulated doors. There's a double glass panel up here between the 2 rooms through which people can see each other quite easily, but it is also effective as a sound barrier. For this particular experiment, we have up in the corner there and here 2 teletypewriters. Anything that is typed on one typewriter automatically appears on the other and vice versa. Some variations of this are that we can have a person interrupt another by freezing the typewriter. That is, communicator A, if he wants to communicate, can interrupt B by pushing a button and freezing the console of the other room, and he is then free to type. This is a minor variation. Here also we have in the center 2 telautograph. These are slaved writing systems. When a person picks up the pen and writes in one room, the pen in the other room picks up and duplicates his handwriting precisely, and vice versa. There are a variety of, I show here in one corner a video system, that is a video camera and a monitor, which has been used in some experiments, not in others. And there are other supplementary sources of information, like tape recorders and microphones and headsets and things of this kind. But in general, this illustrates the one configuration of the laboratory for one particular experiment. We turn that off now, if you will, Dr. Young. Let me say a little bit about the tasks that we use for our experiments. I knew I was charged, but not that much. Our problem-solving tasks differ significantly from those that are generally used in problem-solving in psychology, since they were chosen to meet some very important criteria. First, our problems sample different kinds of psychological functions, verbal skills, psychomotor functions, and so on. Second, they're representative of tasks for which interactive computer systems are now being used or might be used in the future. Third, they're of recognizable and practical importance in everyday life. Our problems are not abstract or artificial puzzles of the kind that are often used by psychologists to study problem solving. Our problems have definite, recognizable solutions, and the solutions can generally be reached within an hour. They require no special skills or knowledge for their solution. And then finally, the problems are formulated in such a way that they require the efforts of two people working together as a team for their solution. We do this by giving each of the two team members complementary information folios. One member of the team, the seeker, is given a problem for which he has to find a solution. His information folio consists of certain parts of the problem. The other team member, the source, our simulated perfect computer, has generally the bulk of the library or file-like information. He, in short, has the folio with the remainder of the information for the problem. So while neither person can solve the problem by himself, the two people working together have all the information necessary to do so. I should point out, however, that our problems are structured to elicit communication. They do not necessarily represent the ways in which these problems would be put into a computer. I want to emphasize that. Altogether, we've constructed about a dozen different problems that meet our needs. Let me tell you a little bit about a few of them so you can get somewhat of the flavor of the kind of thing that our subjects are asked to do. One of our problems is an equipment assembly problem. In this case, the seeker's job is to assemble a common household article. If you will just plug this in now, Carol. A trash can carrier. Here it is disassembled and hung on the wall in exactly the way that the way it would be when you get it from the store. We've simply taken it out of the box and hung it up here in a standard format. It's a lightweight tubular thing, and when you put it together, you put trash cans in and you can trundle your trash cans out to the side. It's sufficiently complex so that it is practically impossible to put it together without information or blueprints. We've had students work at it with just giving them the parts and asking them to put this thing together without telling them what it is, and nobody has succeeded in doing it. Our source has the assembly instructions and the diagrams for putting this thing together. So here we have, this is the seeker's job to put this together. He has to communicate with the source, who has the assembly instructions for doing this. Another one of our problems is a somewhat different kind of problem. We tell the seeker, I missed one sometime. There we are. We tell the seeker that he has a light socket that's burned out and he has to go to the store and find a replacement for it. Here it is. This is the light socket. And when he goes, what he has to do is to communicate with the source, who has a whole lot of these in his inventory, and here they are, all of which are a little bit different. Every one is a little bit different from every other one. Some have two, some are 3/4 inch, some are 3/8, some are metal base, some are Bakelite, some are bayonet, some are screw base, and so on. So they're all different. But what he has to do is to identify this particular one and the model number of that particular light socket. And the problem is to communicate the kind of descriptive information that will enable him to identify that. Another one of our problems involves fault finding in an automobile engine. Now, we couldn't bring an automobile engine conveniently into the room into our lab, but what we did was to build up a mock-up of an automobile engine. And here it is. This is the mock-up of it, and this is a real automobile engine analyzer, a real one that we purchased in Western Electric. Now what we've got here is a distributor head and a coil, and when you plug the thing in, the thing rotates and you can hear the thing going, and it has 3 faults built into it. Now the instructions for using the automobile engine analyzer are in the sources folio. And he has all of the instructions about exactly how the tests go and the sequence in which they're to be used. The problem is to diagnose the faults in this automobile engine. Another kind of problem is a geographic orientation problem, as we call it. Here, the seeker has to find the home address of the physician that is closest to his own hypothetical home address. We give him a street address in Washington, D.C., we give him a map of the city and an index to the streets in Washington. And we're told, here's where you live. You have an aged mother, you need to know the physician who is closest to where you live. The source has stored in him the yellow pages of the Washington, D.C. telephone directory with an alphabetic listing of physicians and surgeons. But this is an alphabetic listing, and the two of them have to communicate to find the physician who is closest to the seeker's home address. Here we have one of our subjects. This is the seeker. He's working here with a map of Washington, D.C. Here's his index of streets, and he is writing some notes here on his pad. We can turn this up now. Now, our subjects have varied from experiment to experiment. We've, of course, relied on the favorite of all psychological experiments, the college student. However, we have used other subjects as well. We've gone out into the local high schools, and we've used male high school students in one experiment, in another, girls from a local parochial high school, and in still other experiments, mixtures of kids of various levels of ability. The findings of our experiments have been so rich and so varied that it would be impossible for me even to do an adequate job of telling you some of the things that we found, or all of the things that we found. But let me try to give you some of the main highlights of our research and things that I think are particularly exciting. If I could have the view graph now, Carol, the next one. This shows the results from one of our experiments, one of our early experiments in which we used a communication-rich mode. This is essentially face-to-face communication. Communication by voice only. You can talk to each other freely, but you cannot see the other person. Handwriting and typewriting using experienced and inexperienced typists. This is the mean time required to solve problems, averaged across problems and all communicators. As you see, we have some fairly large differences here. The difference between the inexperienced typists and the persons in the face-to-face mode is about a factor of 2.5 times. When you're face-to-face, you solve problems much faster than when you communicate by slave typewriters. A couple of astonishing things here to us. I had not anticipated to find so small a difference between the two levels of typists, between the experienced and inexperienced typists. I'll have something more to say about that. And because of the large literature on kinesics, the gestural language, and facial gestures, I had expected to find a much larger difference between voice and communication rich. Remember that here, you can only hear the other person, you can't see him. Here you are face-to-face. Literally, in this experiment, they were face-to-face and could use gestures, pointing, and all of the things that are normally associated with face-to-face communication. If this small difference had appeared only in this one experiment, I might have mistrusted it. But it is a difference that comes up repeatedly in experiment after experiment. Anthropologists and sociologists to the contrary, in this kind of work, the extra information provided by gestures does not appear to contribute a great deal to the communication process. We have some suggestions for why this is the case, but more on that later if you're interested. However interesting these times are, and I want you to remember them when we come to the data that I'm going to show you next, the data are even more interesting when we relate them to the linguistic output of the communicators. Now, the problems of measuring and quantifying that linguistic output have been almost as interesting as the results. Most psycholinguistic research has been done on what I call immaculate prose. Immaculate prose consists of grammatically correct sentences with nouns, verbs, and other parts of speech in their proper places. Words are spelled correctly, and rules of punctuation are observed. All so-called natural language computer programs require immaculate prose, because the sentences that are fed into the computer are parsed in one way or another so that the meaning of the ensemble can be inferred from conventional rules of syntax. Trouble is, people don't talk in sentences. Most of us realize this in a kind of intuitive way, but I suspect that few of us really appreciate how untidy normal human communications really are. In our experiments, we have made audio tape and sometimes videotape recordings of conversations in all communication modes having a voice channel, and then these are transcribed into typewritten protocols. Subjects generate their own protocols, of course, whenever they converse in the handwriting or typewriting modes. Now, at this point, I'm going to ask Dr. Young if she would pass out 2 tables to you, which, could we have the lights, please? Unfortunately, I only brought 75 copies, so you'll have to share these, but I think perhaps you can get the essential point if you will share them with your neighbor. Table 1, the first one that you're going to see, is a literal copy of a part of the typewritten record that was produced by 2 inexperienced typists who were solving the equipment assembly problem. Messages that were typed by the source are in ordinary type, and by the seeker are underlined. This is in Table 1, the one that's identified as Table 1. If you look at Table 1 and read it, I think your first impression will be an impression of complete unruliness. There isn't a single grammatically correct sentence in the entire protocol, not a one. Words are continually misspelled and they're run together. Abbreviations, both conventional and unconventional, are common, and violation of the rules of punctuation is more common than their adherence. There are even instances of serious errors of fact. For example, in the second line in Table 1, the source instructs the seeker about some 38th holes. The seeker queries the source on this point in his next message, and the source replies that his original message is correct. In actual fact, the assembly instructions said, and what the source intended to say, was that the seeker should put his axle through the 3/8 inch holes. Other errors of the same kind can be found in the protocol. For example, on line 8, the source intended to say 1 1/2 inch bolts. Now, I think the astonishing thing is that despite all this apparent unruliness, in spite of all of the garbage that appears to be present in this protocol, the information got through. The 2 team members who worked on this problem completed their tasks successfully in somewhat less than the average time required by teams in general for this problem. Equally astonishing, I think, is the fact this happens to be the record from 2 inexperienced typists, but to us it is equally astonishing to find that the protocols of experienced typists were also characterized by many of the same kinds of errors and ungrammatical features that we find here. Why is this? when the emphasis is on natural communication and not on precision of typing, unruliness tends to creep in to what we say and how we say it, no matter what your level of typing skill. Typewritten protocols of voice communication, and a small sample of one of these is on table 2, have their own special idiosyncrasies that are no less perplexing and just as difficult to deal with. If we're ever to have truly interactive computer systems, they will somehow have to cope with the mispronunciations, the errors and violations of format that are the rule rather than the exception in normal human communication. Discovering these rules and the characteristics is a problem that has too long been ignored by linguists. Now, measuring and counting characteristics of these protocols, or protocols like those that you have here, we wanted to measure things like words, sentences, and messages. And it seemed simple in prospect, but extremely difficult in execution. In the end, we were able, however, to formulate sets of rules that enabled us to count these linguistic units. They're rather unusual rules because we accept errors, we accept things like abbreviations and contractions and other kinds of violations of what are normally considered ordinary syntax, but these are part of our acceptable rules. After we scored all the things, next came the job of trying to decide what kind of a measure you would apply to all of these linguistic units. Based on previous literature and hunches and in some sense, I think our non-useful measures are just as interesting as the useful ones, because the non-useful ones tell us where it is fruitless to try to expend research time and effort in the future. However, to try to tell you about them would take much more time than I have here. They're going to be published in a paper shortly. The 9 productive measures, however, were first and second, the number of messages used by a subject, and a measure that's highly correlated with that, the number of sentences he used. Measures 3 and 4 are the number of words per message, that is message length, and a measure that's highly correlated with that, sentence length. Our 5th measure is the percentage of sentences that were questions. 6 is the total number of words used by a subject. 7 is the total number of different words used by a subject. 8 is the type token ratio, that is the ratio of the number of unique words to total words. And the 9th is communication rate, or the number of words communicated per minute of time actually spent communicating. In a sense, I think our results are disappointing. There's so little to show for all the effort we put into that particular part of our project. In another sense, however, they're gratifying, because what it says is that the linguistic performance of people who communicate naturally can apparently be described by a rather small number of quantitative measures. Let me show you how some of the data came out. If I could have the first view graph, please, Dr. Young. down just a tiny bit.
That's fast. There. That's all right.
And sharpen the focus perhaps a little bit on front, that great big thing up in front, twisting the left. Okay, do it. The big thing that looks like a big eye. There we go, beautiful, thank you. These are, in the top, we see here the mean number of messages that were exchanged in the same experiment where I showed you the times just a little bit ago. And the modes are the same, the communication-rich, face-to-face, voice, handwriting, typewriting, the two kinds of typists. Here is the mean number of words that were exchanged for the same. Now, if you will remember from the first slide, the data slide that I showed you, these were the fast modes of communication. The communication-rich and voice were the fast modes. These were the slow modes. The thing that you'll notice here, however, is that although these voice modes are fast, they're characterized by an enormous number of messages and an enormous number of words that are flying back and forth. The fast modes are the wordy ones. The slow modes are characterized by very few messages and very few words, or relatively few, going back and forth. If we could slip up to the next one now. That's the one we're looking for.
I'll try to get that down.
That'll do.
Is that all right?
I guess that'll do. Here is communication rate. That is the number of words per minute of actual communication time. Again, the enormous difference between the voice modes and the relatively slow hard copy modes. The communicators here are speaking at about a rate of 175 words a minute approximately, and this is about the rate at which talkers prepare talking books for the blind. On the other hand, communication rates for the hard copy modes are very slow, around something of the order of 8 to 18 words per minute. With regard to the total number of different words, about the same kind of result appears. In the two oral modes, the thing that you find is that the oral modes are characterized by a lot of different words, and the hard copy modes, the handwriting and typewriting, by relatively few unique words. As a result, when we compute what we call the type token ratio, what we find is that the type token ratio for the oral modes, that is the spoken modes, is much lower, about 0.3, than for the hard copy modes, which is about 0.5 or 0.6. This is the ratio. In other words, what this says is that when you type or handwrite, you use a much greater proportion of unique words to the total number of words. In a way, this is saying that oral communication is redundant. Well, to summarize very quickly the results of these linguistic measures, I think the most striking thing about them is that the two communication modes that are so fast, that is the two channels or the two modes that have a voice channel, the fast ones are wordy, and they're wordy by almost any measure that you want to compute. As compared with the hard copy modes, subjects in the two voice modes used about 8 times as many messages, 8 times as many sentences, 5 times as many words, twice as many different words, and communicated at a rate about 10 times as fast. Now, if you recall that the first 4 of these are for much shorter solution times, then the differences are even more impressive. To sum up, the voice modes are fast modes of communicating, but they're wordy no matter how you measure wordiness. It would be nice to measure the redundancy, and the type token ratio suggests that the redundancy in the oral modes is greater than in the hard copy modes. Measuring redundancy in these experiments is very difficult because the data don't lend themselves to conventional measurements of redundancy, such as have been used by information theorists. First of all, information theory is essentially a statistical kind of measure that isn't concerned with, it's concerned only with the ensemble and the statistical properties of ensembles. It is not concerned with meaning. Here we are clearly concerned with meaning. However, by making certain plausible assumptions, I've been able to compute that in the voice modes, that is face-to-face or in voice, subjects use about 13 times as many words as are really required to solve these problems, and about 4 times as many unique words as are really required, which indicates a considerable amount of redundancy. By the same measures, in the hard copy modes, the handwriting and typewriting, these measures are only about 1 to 1.5. Let me, if I could have the next one, which I think should be a sheet of paper. These are some data from an experiment in which we used 10 different modes of communication. And they're ordered here along the baseline. Fine, thank you. From very rich to very impoverished modes. Here is our communication rich, face-to-face communication. This is voice and video, in essence closed-circuit television, voice and handwriting, voice and typewriting, voice only, getting progressively impoverished, handwriting and video, typewriting and video, handwriting and typewriting, handwriting only and typewriting only. These are the average times required to solve several kinds of problems, and they're averaged over all problems and all teams. The most striking thing about these data, I think, is that they fall into 2 clear-cut groups. These 5 and these 5. In fact, this is the only difference that is statistically, this is the only component of variance that is statistically significant in the analysis. These are 5 fast modes, and these are 5 slow modes. The thing that characterizes the fast modes is that they all have a voice channel. The thing that characterizes the 5 slower modes is that none of them has a voice channel. And I think perhaps this explains why Ma Bell and AT&T represent one of the largest corporations in America. The telephone is a very effective way of communicating. And this is simply a finding that illustrates this. The data on messages are about the same, although reversed. Although these are the fast modes, we find many more messages here in these 5, far fewer messages in the hard copy modes. I won't give you those data, but they're about like that. In one other experiment, we tested a somewhat different kind of situation, one in which the modes are mixed, comparable to the situation in which you might talk to a computer and the computer reply by a teletypewriter, or you might type into a computer and the computer reply by voice. And if we could have that now, Dr. Young, I think that's in one of the reprints, right? Here we are, that's the one. Let me explain what went on here. We have here our source and seeker as before. However, in this first case right here, the source and seeker both communicate by voice. Here, the seeker has a voice and the source replies by typewriter. Here, the seeker has a typewriter and the source replies by voice, and here they both use typewriters. The 2 end conditions, typewriter, typewriter, and voice, voice, duplicate essentially the conditions that we used in an earlier experiment. They represent a difference of about 2 to 1, which is almost exactly what you saw in the first data slide that I showed you earlier. When you have mixed modes of communication, then what you find is that the performance is in between that of the pure typewriter and pure voice. Again, representing the addition that comes from the voice channel. Interruptions in normal communication are so common and apparently so important that we've tested their effects in a separate experiment. Briefly, let me summarize briefly what the data show. They say that if you don't have the freedom to interrupt, people use fewer messages, more words per message, and maintain a relatively constant number of messages whether you speak or write. Whether you speak or write. If you have the freedom to interrupt, it doesn't shorten the time necessary to solve problems, but what happens is that you package your words differently. You use more messages, fewer words per message, and maintain a relatively constant message length, no matter how you communicate. What we find, too, is that subjects are much more inclined to take control of a channel whenever they have a voice channel. They're much more likely to push the button that interrupts the communication link, and much less likely to do so whenever they have a typewriting, handwriting, or video channel, but without voice, either singly or in any combination. I think I'll stop on all of the illustrations now, Dr. Young. Let me say a word or two about the generality of our findings. In research of this kind, there's always the question, have you really found out some general principles of human communication, or have you merely found out about particular pieces of equipment? I think we found some general principles of human communication. And my reasons for thinking this is that we have tested some of these various channels in distinctively different ways. For example, in one of our experiments, people communicated in the voice channel by talking through a grill cloth panel that separated them. This is a visually opaque but acoustically transparent grill cloth panel. In another experiment, subjects communicated in the voice mode by having a microphone fixed on the desk and a loudspeaker on the wall. In still another experiment, the subject wore a boom microphone and had communications come through on a speaker. In spite of these distinctly different ways of using the voice channel, the results are gratifyingly similar. They are all virtually identical, which makes me suspect and believe that we are in fact finding out something about the voice channel and not a particular way in which that voice channel is mediated. Similarly, we have run handwriting tests in which people wrote notes in books and simply passed the notebook back and forth between two rooms. In other experiments, we've used a slave telautograph system, where when you write in one room, it's automatically recorded in another. Once again, the results from both of these kinds of tests are gratifyingly similar. But even more important is a somewhat more technical kind of evidence, I think, that is bears on this business of generality, and that is that the results that we get with our different modes of communication hold for all of the kinds of problems that we have tested and for both of the job roles, that is the seeker and source job roles that we've assigned to our communicators. If I were to be technical and precise, what I would say is that when we analyze our data with the analysis of variance, we find very few significant interactions between modes of communication and problems, or between modes of communication and job roles. In other words, our findings about the modes of communication are extremely robust, and they appear to hold for all of the kinds of problems that we've tested and for both kinds of tasks that we give the communicators. Now, as so often happens in research, the questions that we've turned up are much more numerous than the findings that we have been able to come up with. Everyone who has listened to me or who has read any of my papers on this subject, I'm sure, must have a whole list, his own special list of questions that still need to be solved. Let me tell you 4 questions that really intrigue me. Question 1 is, how do communication patterns differ among different nationalities? Anthropologists and sociologists tell us, and our own experience seems to confirm, that communication patterns differ markedly among different cultural groups. Would we get the same kinds of results if we had studied French-speaking, German-speaking, Hebrew-speaking, or Arabic-speaking persons? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. What sorts of concessions will computers and telecommunication systems in general have to make for peoples of different nationalities? A large, unexplored area of research that's worth a dozen PhD theses for those of you who are looking for a thesis. My second question, how do communication patterns vary according to the purpose of the communication? By and large, our research so far has singled out factual problems for solution. They have single answers, and the information needed for the solution of the problems was directed toward that goal. But interactive communication, even with computers, may serve many different functions. A communicator may browse through masses of data for items that he needs, or for items that merely excite his interest or curiosity. He may want to have briefing and status reports that will help him anticipate the weather conditions for the next few hours or days, review the state of economy, or update his information about the condition of patients in a hospital. Communications can also provide information necessary for reaching decisions among conflicting alternatives, and they can be used for argumentation, bargaining, and persuasion. Virtually nothing is known about how communication patterns vary according to these diverse purposes subserved by these communications. My third question is, what happens to communication patterns when you start increasing the number of communicators? All our experiments so far have been done with 2-person teams, but interactive communication can and does take place among more than 2 people. How do communication patterns vary as the number of communicators, perhaps one of them a computer, increases? What implications does this have for teleconferencing in business, government, medicine, and education? Nobody really knows. And my last question, and the most intriguing one of all to me, is, what are the rules that govern normal human communication? What are the grammatical, syntactical, and semantic rules that apply to natural, unrestrained human communications? Despite their apparent unruliness, and you have 2 examples in your hands, they obviously follow some rules, because problems get solved, and they get solved very efficiently at that. But how are the meanings conveyed in these natural communications? How do you even go about studying the problem? Well, this brief introduction to my research program, I hope, has managed to convey to you a few of the interesting findings that we've made, and perhaps it will even excite some of you to undertake research in this area as well. And if a number of us get together and work on these problems, who knows? Maybe at some time in the future, to get the answer to Turing's question, can machines think, you won't have to listen to a lecture by a man named Al, but talk to a computer named Hal.